Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the Lions over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.
Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we bring you the worst music, without question, that the podcast industry has to offer, but the best analysis on the business of audio that you're going to find anywhere in the marketplace. We have a wonderful show for you today and a panel of experts that I'm very excited about. I am still Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road. I am here podcasting from world headquarters here in Sherman Oaks, California, where the sun is setting and it's a beautiful, almost evening. I am joined by some very special people. We're welcoming back to the Media Roundtable Kyle Jelinek, who is celebrating a recent promotion at Oxford Road by shaving off all of his facial hair, it seems like. Welcome, Kyle. What's going on?
I joined the swim team here in Nashville, and I just need to smooth everything out. So I'm ready and excited to be on.
I like it. I like it. And that brings us to our next panelist. The great and powerful James Cridland is here, editor of Podnews and Podcast Business Journal. Welcome, James. Where are you beaming in from today?
Thank you. Today I'm in sunny Brisbane, and I have not shaved my beard, although it's not much of a beard, to be frank. So there you go.
I'm with you. I couldn't do it if I tried. Also with the hairless face, we have Scott MacDonell, who's been on this show before as a guest. He was wearing his hat as a chief audio officer. Of course, this show is in service of the chief audio officer. And he came on a couple of years ago to do an interview. But Scott is somebody that's had a very windy relationship with Oxford Road over the last 10 years. I've known him for 20. Not only is he a good friend, but also he was our managing director at Oxford Road at one point. And Scott, how many times have you actually been a client on behalf of a brand with Oxford Road?
Off the top of my head, it's 5, but there's probably a couple more in, places that I was an advisor for and referred the business over to Oxford Road.
That's
I'm clearly biased.
Well, thank you for all of the hats that you wear and continuing to partner with us here. So you'll have some great perspectives. I'm glad to have you on the panel. So let's get to it. It's a brand new year. The world is changing quickly as it's been doing. And Kyle, I think you're going to kick off talking a little bit about programmatic and what's happening in that space.
Sure. Yeah. This first article came from Inc. Talking all about programmatic and how its programmatic audio is expected to double by the end of next year to $4 billion. I think it poses the question of how is this going to impact podcasts? And my take is, frankly, podcast will continue to expand its programmatic capabilities, but it's never really going to take away from the host endorsement and the connection that the clients can make with the host. I think we're far away from that. The article talks about the potential of this happening in the next couple of years, but I still think that the connection that clients make with the host is not going to be easily replaced with programmatic. It will just be in addition to what we're already doing.
So do you think that they're going to try to make endorsements something that can be bought programmatically?
According to this article, yes, but I think the networks are going to fight that tooth and nail.
Yeah, interesting. James, what do you make of all this, and what do you think it means?
Well, I mean, I think it is interesting seeing the rise of programmatic audio, and I would agree. I think with Kyle that actually, one of the benefits of podcasting is, and if this is a drinking game, pour yourself a shot, is that it is intimate. And that's one of the things about podcasting that actually other media it isn't particularly. And I'm not sure that programmatic ads that are thrown in there by an algorithm necessarily work quite so well. So I think certainly it's worthwhile keeping an eye on. But I'm in terms of where podcasting's strengths are, it's all around the host, it's all around the host's recommendations to you. And I think programmatic audio is a different conversation, I think, here.
And Scott, when you think about the value of programmatic as a buyer and somebody that's worked for a number of different performance marketing groups, do you see a difference in the value of an impression that is programmatic versus when you're dealing direct with a publisher?
Very much so. That's even assuming that the impression occurs, because I am guilty of when I get to an ad break within audio and it is on demand, of hitting that 30-second forward button as quickly as possible to get past it. Versus, a couple of things that you get from a host-read ad. One is that very often that ad can come up right in the middle of content. You're already hooked. You're already listening. It sounds like part of the show. And, drinking game, it's back to that intimacy, that connection with the audience that the host has, that it's very hard for a voiceover host and some ad writer in New York City to connect the same way that host can. So I discount it. And the way I think about it is I actually look at my audio budget in two different buckets. It's like, what is our baked in host read ads doing versus what is our programmatic ads doing? I do not lump them all in as one whole kind of like, here's our audio piece. And that keeps me honest on the rates that I'm willing to pay for programmatic.
Kyle, you've got your ear to the ground really closely on this one, because you're working with brands on the buying side and having to look at the consequences of doing that. When you think about programmatic in podcast, is it really truly, is the only problem with using programmatic that, oh, well, you don't get to do those endorsements in the same customized way? Or is there also a problem in the execution and the way that it's distributed? Do we have mechanical problems that are challenging beyond just the swapping of the recommended versus the produced ad?
Very much so. I mean, it comes down to the network. Every network treats the programmatic segment slightly different. You're reliant upon targeting challenges and whether or not we actually believe that we're truly targeting who we think we're targeting. That's a big question.
So break that down. Like, let's get really tactical here. So if you're working with the person who's the chief audio officer, the person responsible for the success of the audio campaign at a brand, like, what are the actual dimensions of the problem when you actually go to execute it and market?
Well, what I found is you can start and you set up your target, and then you find that when you go to execute, there's a bunch of limitations given by individual networks that you can't necessarily do the way that you want. Like, whether it be the targeting that you want to reach isn't necessarily available, and you have to go around it into a different way. And that varies by network, in my experience, making it pretty challenging just to do a blank. I think on streaming, it's a little bit more straightforward, but in podcast, it gets really, really complicated.
Yeah, and I guess I want to challenge the fundamental assumption, because look, I think we have a lot of people on the publisher side that are listening to this show and paying attention to some of this, and I want to make sure our message is clear as we look at it on behalf of the advertiser. You hear over and over again about the value of the personal recommendation, and let's just imagine that on average, an ad that you're going to produce yourself and use really creative people to go and introduce yourself to an audience, versus the host of the show going, let me tell you about this experience I had and this thing that I think is wonderful, and use that recommendation in a much more organic way connected to the content. You may see anywhere from a 50% increase in performance on that impression to, 500 to 1,000% increase. The value of that impression that you earned from a listener is significantly higher with the endorsement, right? And the part where I feel that the industry is being very short-sighted is that chasing programmatic makes sense on paper in the short term because it makes the sales process much more efficient. You don't have to have a conversation with somebody and have a specific negotiation on every single deal, which sounds good, right? On the other hand, even you're going to have to sell 3-4 times as many ads in the same show just to deliver the same value to a brand. And so you're actually undermining the experience of the listener. You're giving them a reason to go listen to something else. You're giving them a reason to fast forward. You're diluting the actual value of the program that you're selling. And when it totals out, I would rather have a show with half as many ads and more than twice as much of a premium from a CPM standpoint per ad if it's on a bed of endorsements versus on a bed of programmatic units. And so I feel that it's like we can yell about endorsements till we're blue in the face, but I think there is a business and a revenue opportunity that actually works for all parties if you don't turn it into radio, if you don't just shove in 20 ads an hour. Even setting aside our current challenges of the fact that they're not all getting executed correctly, and we have limitations in our ability to frequency cap, to target, to do all those things. Those are secondary problems. The primary problem is that I think we're chasing something that's easier to transact, but not nearly as valuable as what they could be selling. So the advertisers lose, the listeners lose, and ultimately the publishers and creators lose because they're diluting their own product in a way that they don't have to. Any other thoughts on that? All right, enough about programmatic. That's our daily gripe about, or our weekly gripe about programmatic and why we can't put all our eggs in that basket. Scott, you found some research that may not be a new concept, but there's certainly new data to support an old idea. Can you introduce some of what you learned from Edison?
Yeah, this data is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody on this podcast, but certainly might be a surprise for some of the listeners. And this comes from Edison Research's share of ear study. The finding is that ad-supported audio reaches 84% of adults 13 plus on a daily basis. And what's more interesting potentially to me is that even for the 18 to 34-year-olds, that elusive target that everybody's trying to grab, 82% of those people are reached on a daily basis. Just for definition, Edison defines ad-supported audio as AM/FM radio, podcast, ad-based streaming services such as Pandora, spoken word channels on SiriusXM, and the free use of YouTube and music videos. Now, that's arguably video, but it is actually people listening to music and getting an ad because of it. If you contrast those numbers against other, first of all, let's look at other media numbers. So that those numbers are higher than the numbers that Netflix gets, the numbers that Hulu gets. This study points to all over 4 hours of average listening a day to ad-supported media. Now, I personally am going to have a hard time with that number, 4 hours. It's hard to imagine that much. But at the lowest end, I'm seeing it close to 3 hours. So somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, people are listening to a lot of audio during the day, and a lot of audio that marketers can have a say in, can reach a customer. This is not too far off from the amount spent with digital or social media during the day. Now, you look at the budgets that brands are spending in audio, and the findings come back, pretty starkly that brands are generally underinvested in audio from 12% to north of 25%. Why? Because they've got a certain amount of budget, and that budget is going elsewhere. When the ears and the impressions are, a lot of that actually is in audio, and so I think a lot of brands are just missing the boat. And let me just go into my ancient history for a second. I kind of know why that happens. I was a big time media buyer for a big time. I probably shouldn't say names. One of the biggest companies in the world, one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. We had our media plans, our media budgets, and radio was going to be part of that. But we spent all of our time back in the day on what's happening with the TV advertising, nascent digital advertising. How many insertions are we going to put in People magazine and National Geographic? Radio was such an afterthought. It was almost like, I remember my boss coming in and telling me, like, okay, we got 5% of the budget left. throw it to audio. And I didn't even know what that meant. It meant giving it to a radio buyer, and I didn't know what they did with it. I was like, oh, here's my radio plan. I think that's the way a lot of agencies and brands potentially look at audio. It was years later when I went to LegalZoom and saw the immediate impact of audio, how LegalZoom goes from 1% brand awareness, give or take 1%, to very quickly 35% of the country knowing us just on the back of audio. Like, aha, we've got something. And, you know, as you know, Dan, we did this with many brands since then. And so brands have got to take a look at where the people are listening, because there's a lot of options for them.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think I was hunting for some data that I knew that we had carried. It's a couple of years old now, but it's from WARC and iHeartMedia. And they came out with two numbers which I thought were fantastic. 31% of the average consumer's media consumption is audio. 31%, which is an incredible figure. Then you have a look at the average media budget, only 8.8% of that is given to audio. So audio is, you know, there's a real investment gap there. Even more interesting, a quarter of all advertisers don't invest in audio at all. And that's a real missed opportunity. But there again, you know, those people, those chief audio officers who are having a listen to this show, already bucking that particular trend. But yeah, there's a real gap there in terms of audio consumption and the amount of money which is actually spent in that.
I'm getting so old because when I worked in radio, I'd listen to. It's like you ever hear your parents say something, you hear yourself saying something your parents used to say, and then you go, "Oh, what is happening?"
Yeah.
I used to sit in meetings, and these executives at the radio company I worked for would talk about how audio's not getting its fair share, and we don't get, you know, what we deserve for what we're doing. And I was like, we need to earn it. You know, we don't deserve it probably. But like, you don't, you know, fair's got nothing to do with it. But now as I'm, you know, getting, I think, more, now that I've just kind of accepted that audio is my home and my fate, I'm looking around and I'm like, hey, you know what? It really is undervalued. And I was throwing around some stats last year that I saw that suggested that we were only getting about 50% of the dollars in advertising relative to the time spent with the channel. But I was looking at some numbers last week, and I was working with Neil on our team, who's on the show a lot. And what we found was that, you know, by some estimates, it depends on how you carve it and which channels you count, right? But actually, I think I was understating the problem, and I think that's what you're doing with this article. But most people agree that in the U.S. you got close to 4 hours of consumer time a day with audio, and internationally it's 3 and change. But that's about, you get about 20% of a consumer's time. The share of spend, I mean, we're looking at potentially hitting $1 trillion in global ad spend for all media in 2024. Audio, if we're lucky, you know, is going to do maybe 36 billion of that. But basically, I think the way a lot of the projections that I've seen are shaking out is that relative to time spent with the channel, it only gets about a dollar for every 6 that any other average media type gets for the same amount of time. So we are so heavily undervalued in this channel. And I don't know exactly why it is, but I suspect some of the reasons that marketers generally shy away from it are that, 1, it's hard to use. 2, it's just not as sexy as social media or something with video, right? I think that so many associations with radio, which was kind of dormant in terms of innovation for decades and decades, I think we have a bit of a reputation problem and a bit of an understanding problem on how to use it. And honestly, I don't think the industry helps itself because we do a poor job showing advertisers about how it performs on a relative basis, impression for impression. Because I believe, and look, you guys know, I got to spend 6 months as a CMO for a company a couple years ago, and I got to look across all these channels. There is no question in my mind that audio punches well above the average for media opportunities. but and it can't even get close to getting its fair share. So here I am now, another old guy going, audio doesn't get its fair share, but it is what it is. And I think the message to any marketer is, whatever you're doing in audio, you could probably increase it substantially. But most brands, for whatever reason, they go, yeah, 28% of somebody's time is with the channel, but I'm only going to spend, 5 or 10% of our budget with it. It's a big gap. Why do you guys think that audio is so far behind in getting what its actual worth is? What do you think the barriers are?
I think for lack of a better word, I think that the word you use, sexy, really comes to play here. And I remember back to the big agency days where the copywriters would spend all their time on the print ad and the TV ads where they really enjoyed themselves. And then again, radio was an afterthought. It was like, oh, how are we going to take this 30-second TV ad and add some words and make it a 60-second radio ad? Or how do we just repurpose this to a 30-second radio ad? It was like the TV ad was everything. And that was weeks of work. The radio ad could have been an afternoon of work. Where, Dan, you and I know, like, radio ads are really a lot of fun, like really playing on that theater of the mind. And I, as someone who's written big time print ads, TV ads, and radio ads, I'll take radio ads all day long. It's much more interesting to play with and think about, okay, what is the image I need to paint right now through audio?
I just think about when, I work with a company for years, sometimes on an audio campaign, somewhat staying under the radar from the executives at the company that we're working with. And then the minute we start talking TV, everybody comes out of the woodwork. Everybody wants to start talking about it. And then all of a sudden it's TV is the biggest thing. And I think it comes down to what Scott was saying. It just gets the interest of these people. Maybe it's the visual component. I don't know. But for whatever reason, radio seems to just kind of fly under the radar.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time selling radio ads to direct clients. I didn't sell them, I wrote them. But going with a salesperson in to see a direct client. And one of the things that really struck me is they have their print ads. I mean, this was 20 years ago, so they were still using papers. They had their print ads on the wall, in some cases framed. This is our print ad. And for a while, what we thought would be fun is to print out the script, frame a cassette tape alongside the script and give it to them as
you get the engineer to autograph it.
Yeah, put that next to your print ad. Because that is just as valuable. And I do wonder that because it isn't a tangible thing, because audio ads aren't a tangible thing that you can hold, that you can see, that you can frame in your office, I do wonder whether that is something that actually just sort of brings audio down in some people's minds.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do think we should continue the conversation, because as we're trying to use this show not just to give commentary, but to provide actionable insights that are going to help the marketers, but also create a more sustainable ecosystem. I think there's an elephant in the room here, where we know podcast gets a lot of hype. It's got the sex appeal that I think audio has not had, as it's been led by radio. But still, even that, it's only 10% of the bucket. And something needs to happen, I think, for the level of investment that the whole industry is going to need to make the changes as it prepares to go, fully from analog to digital. I think it's going to need more support. And I think the industry needs to be a little bit more innovative in how it represents itself. And if you don't have James Cridland to go on your sales calls with you and print out the audio scripts, there's going to have to be something to church the place up a little bit, because we're having a hard time, I think, telling the story as an industry in a way that it's effective. Now, all that being said, I only say that with my love of the medium hat on, but as somebody in the advertising space representing brands, it's all upside because there's so much value. And in some respects, it's better because we can get it so much cheaper than it probably is actually worth. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting, yeah. You have
And
another
I
thought
think
on that?
I think we could get concrete about the value, and actually, because results and revenue and efficient revenue, I think is probably the sexiest thing, and a CMO could be CMO, vice president of marketing, whatever, could be looking at. And I've had the benefit of, because I've managed several channels, of looking at channel by channel what the most where the most effective money is, and whereas paid search, social media, paid social, you might get your best cost per acquisition of a new customer, your most efficient cost per visitor. And time again, I see that audio well outperforms digital 3 times, 4 times in conversion rates, in lifetime value for that customer that came in through that channel, and also in repurchase rates. And so to me, that's sexy.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the job of the industry is not necessarily that we even need more listeners, is just that the story about the value for a brand who's sponsoring it, I think needs to be told in a more compelling way and needs to have some data behind it. But that's certainly not what's been leading the charge.
Yeah.
It's really just about how inefficient we are in doing these multi-million-dollar upfront deals with famous people. And I think the industry has to make a better business case for itself. All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. With that, some of the tools that people use are things like IAB certification to show your legitimacy. James, sounds like some people may be in jeopardy of losing that ability. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, and it almost sounds as if the industry is almost losing their love for the IAB. I mean, if you remember back in 2017 when the IAB Tech Lab launched the podcast measurement guidelines, that was a real breath of fresh air, because all of a sudden we actually had one definition of a download, really simple, straightforward definition of a download, and everybody knew what a download was. And that was a big change back in 2017. There were all kinds of different numbers being, quoted, and spurious numbers. Now, though, I think if you have a look at what's going on with the IAB's place in the podcasting industry, I'm not so sure that the IAB is necessarily in the same place. If you look at quite a lot of the podcast companies, they were certified under an earlier version of the podcast guidelines, version 2.0. The IAB said you have to complete certification for the current version 2.1, by December 2022. Now, that was over a year ago, and there are still 10 companies who haven't done that. So 10 companies who haven't recertified to the latest spec. But also, there are many different companies that haven't recertified at all over the last 12 months, because the IAB also says to keep your certification current, you need to recertify every 12 months, which to me sounds quite sensible. 8 certified companies, only 6 have recertified. So I wonder whether or not the IAB's offering is necessarily the right one if most of the large podcast companies simply aren't bothering to recertify, even though the IAB has asked them to.
Well, and so what is the commercial value? How does this help the people that take the time and energy to certify or recertify? What's in it for them?
Well, I wonder whether there are two things here. There's what is the commercial value for a podcast hosting company? Now, if you're somebody like Libsyn or Captivate or Buzzsprout, and probably if you look at Captivate or Buzzsprout, those are the smaller podcast companies in terms of revenue, in terms of advertising revenue, and I kind of question why they should be even IAB, certifying themselves anyway, given that they're not actually going out and selling the ads. Somebody else is going out and selling the ads. It's a bit like if you're a radio broadcaster, the person that owns the transmitter going out and getting, Arbitron information. It doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense. How old am I talking about Arbitron? But you know what I mean. So I wonder whether the right people are certifying. But I also wonder, frankly, whether and I've said this in the past on this show, whether or not the IAB, who also deal with streaming video and those lovely flashing ad banners and Punch the Monkey and all that kind of stuff, I wonder whether the IAB have podcasting's, podcasting in mind when they're talking about all this stuff, and whether or not we are better as an industry in having a podcasting advertising bureau that would be co-funded by all of the large podcasters, but would be there to actually talk about the benefits of podcasting, not even just the benefits of audio, but the benefits of podcasting and, setting the standards and everything else. And I wonder whether that's possibly where the industry ought to be going now.
So I'm not going to ask you to say anything negative from your point of view about the IAB, and we're certainly not here to trash anybody. But
No.
What are the arguments as to why their credibility is diminished? Is it, as you were saying earlier, because they're trying to juggle so many different digital channels, or what's the case against caring about that type of certification?
I mean, I think the IAB certification is a super useful tool. It's really helpful to know that a download. I mean, it's not quite a standard. It's just a guideline, and the numbers are actually still different, but depending on which podcast host you're on. But it's far, far closer, and it's really helpful to know what a podcast download is and what it's defined as. I just wonder whether the IAB is juggling a lot of different things, and whether, from a podcasting standpoint, whether or not actually the costs of being part of a large organization such as the IAB necessarily scale when you're talking about, relatively small companies that aren't selling advertising for themselves, like some of those smaller podcast hosting companies that I was talking about there. So I just wonder whether there's a mismatch in between what the IAB is there for and how the podcast industry actually works.
So is there anyone that is creating something that is closer to a podcast advertising bureau, as you're describing?
I'm not sure necessarily that I've seen anyone. You could have a look at Sounds Profitable, I guess, and see whether or not, and they are doing certain things there. But I don't know whether that is necessarily the right model for where we're moving forward. But I think, certainly if you have a look at the radio industry, for example, elsewhere, they aren't jumped in with, you know, every single broadcast company. They have their own radio advertising bureaus in the UK, in Australia, in Finland. Those industry associations doing really, really well for the radio industry, and radio advertising is increasing, revenue is increasing in those areas. I think as soon as you start bundling in television, or you start bundling in online video, or you start bundling in, you know, YouTube and the likes of that, I think it gets much more woolly in terms of what that industry is there for and what that association is there for.
Well, it's interesting, you know, sounds profitable, very focused on podcast, Internet Advertising Bureau, IAB, very focused on all forms of internet advertising. And what you don't have, and then as you said, there's a lot of radio groups that have launched historically, but are kind of losing their relevance, right? But it feels like there may be a gap in the middle between hyper specialization on one fragment of audio, which is podcast, and being so broad that you're trying to manage all of the internet. It seems like maybe there is a need for a consolidated group around the concept of audio that can envelop radio, digital radio, podcast, and maybe have some limits there, but be able to go wide enough and deep enough to satisfy the needs of that part of the industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. Scott is nodding his head. Scott, what do you think on that?
Are you going to start that now, Scott?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and I was just thinking, like, wow, man, why doesn't James start this? This would be perfect. And in your spare time, James.
You seem bored, yeah.
Good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
No, I generally, I mean, I think for me, I would love standardization around, you know, once and for all, like, what is a download across any device, you know, whether it's whatever it is. I want standardization around listenership and things like that. But one of the things that I've always loved about podcasts is that, and I hope it doesn't fully get standardized and fully lose this, which is this feeling of the wild, wild west, that anything can happen, that one show could have no ads. One show could have one ad. And you know, that my first podcast placement was in 2011. And back then it was just like, you know, hey, I've got $50. Will you read this script for me, Mr. Adam Carolla? That wasn't the true price, but the numbers were ridiculous back then. And for us to fully lose that, and for podcasts to get fully regimented beyond like our agreements around measurement, I'm not anxious to see that.
Well, I'll tell you who has very little interest in this subject is Kyle, because he's had nothing to add to it. But I'm going to put you on the spot, Kyle, to change the subject for us. And unless you want to chime in about the IAB and the rating certifications, I'd love to hear about retail media networks, frankly.
Yeah, well, Retail Touchpoints put out an article. I'm done. I'm moving on.
He wants nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with it. No, Retail Touchpoints released an article. I think it kind of, this is an expansion on what we've been talking about earlier in the episode. But the marketing executives are facing budget constraints this year. 71% of CMOs report feeling that they have insufficient budgets for their advertising strategies, despite the fact that advertising as a whole in the US is supposed to go up 5.1%. And specifically in the retail segment and how they're leveraging their data, the article really is an ad for digital audio as a channel to achieve efficient growth. It cites much of the same things that we're talking about: the time spent listening, the proximity between getting exposed to an audio ad and actually making a retail purchase. Go ahead, Dan. Did you say
well,
something?
I just wanted you to clarify more what you mean by retail, because you know, sometimes that can mean the music you're hearing when you're shopping. So can you just be a little more clear in how you're defining it?
For sure, yeah. So oftentimes, you know, because the way people consume, they're in their car, they've got their AirPods on, they're listening to podcasts, and they're in and around making a a purchase at a retail establishment, a physical brick and mortar store. And the rest of the article is really just talking about how, look, if you've got unspent budget, retail marketers should consider audio as a greater portion. And it echoes some of the things that we were talking about earlier here.
Well, let me ask you a question. Practically speaking, so let's say that, I don't want us just to be an infomercial for audio the whole time, but let's say I'm a marketer. I manage a number of channels. I go, all right, I know I can find efficiencies in audio. Audio has many tentacles. Now, Kyle, which path, all things being equal, would you recommend? Which slice of audio would you recommend that a marketer typically allocate to first? Because I think you can make a case for any of it. So where do you think there's the greatest need or opportunity, rather?
I mean, I think it depends on what your footprint looks like. If you are a national brand, that's obviously going to be a different strategy, but it's rare to hear retail ads in podcasts. And I think there's a huge opportunity for that. For national brands that have a national footprint, I think that there's a huge opportunity in the podcast space that's not being taken advantage of.
I spent a lot of years not talking about terrestrial radio. And I think the worse it gets for terrestrial, we talk about the iceberg melting slowly. The worse it gets every year, the more I want to talk about it, because I feel like the value for marketers continues to increase. What you're able to buy, the cost of an impression on radio today versus 5 years ago, I think is significantly better. And sometimes I wonder if I were a regional retailer, would I try to do fancy digital targeting, or would I just buy remnant radio? Even if you're a national retailer, I think that there's it's maybe the least obvious place to look, but potentially the highest value, because there's such little pressure on it right now as everybody flees for digital. What do you think about, Scott, as a marketer? How do you think about that kind of logic?
I'm still, so I remember, this is a few years ago now, but I remember asking a bunch of young people that worked for me, who listens to radio, in this room. No hands went up. And then I started saying some host names. Do you know who Ryan Seacrest is? Yeah, I know who Ryan Seacrest is, but that's from the TV show. Do you know what the do you guys know what the iHeart Music Festival is? Yeah, we know what that is. How do you know about that? Well, I guess it was radio, but I don't listen much. They're really trying to downplay radio very quickly. The numbers are, it is that slow melting iceberg. We all know that. But the millions and millions of people that are still listening there, and you think about, I remember it used to be on retail strategy, it's depending on the frequency of purchase, that would kind of dictate your frequency of how you would use the medium. So that was a lot of potentially local radio in and around the brick and mortar stores. Unfortunately, brick and mortar stores didn't really have a "how did you hear about us" survey to know that the radio was really working. It was just like, well, the audience is here, we might as well spend some ads here. But I still think it could be a very, very effective tool.
I think the one caveat is that as the iceberg melts, the part that is leaving is younger. And it's almost like if you have a core constituency that's younger than 45, you probably should be looking at digital audio. But if, depending on the product, certainly there's a case to be made and an opportunity to be had. So with that, Scott, staying with you, and talking about what the kids are doing these days.
Yeah.
Tell us about what podcasts and YouTube.
Well, this has been a alarming story for me, and I know James has some things to say about this as well. But so since really the rollout starting around October, YouTube is now fulfilling its promise to support RSS feeds, meaning that you can send your, you can send your podcast right into YouTube. Now, that's great because YouTube has become like the dominant form of listening to a podcast. It's amazing to me to think about, but it's now beating the percentage of people that listen to YouTube, get their podcasts from YouTube, now beats both Apple and Spotify combined, which really happened fast. Like a year ago, those Spotify and Apple were the dominant players. So that's potentially exciting for advertisers because why? Well, there's a different way maybe to get into that audience. Maybe you're buying YouTube ads into the podcast that you want to advertise in. There is some downsides though, which is that for the podcaster and potentially the advertiser, YouTube is not going to be accepting any RSS feeds with programmatic, dynamically inserted ads in them. You're kind of like starting from scratch once it gets over to the YouTube side. And that means you're going to have to look at your analytics differently and potentially your creative differently. I had something so important to say there. Any questions so far?
I think James has
one
some
of the
comments.
things I would I think one of the things I would challenge is that YouTube is more popular than Spotify or Apple. Yes, some of the data says that more people use YouTube. Well, yeah, I mean, of course they do. But are they consuming the same podcasts that they would on Apple and Spotify? Absolutely not. And you can go and have a look at, for example, all of NPR's shows are available on YouTube. The numbers that they do on YouTube, which are public, of course, because you can see those view counts, are pitiful, which is a good thing because you can't advertise in those. You're not allowed a 30-second dynamically inserted ad in a podcast on YouTube. YouTube will not accept that. And worse than that, yes, you're allowed sponsor credits. Yes, you're allowed host reads. But what you're not allowed to do is have any control over what YouTube sticks around those particular shows as well. So your competitor might be in there. Your competitor might get the pre-roll before you go into a show which is sponsored by you. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful in terms of where YouTube is going and how popular YouTube is really. At the end of the day, there's a long conversation around what is a podcast, and I am so bored of that conversation. But I do think that there is certainly something around people who think that they are consuming a podcast. What is a podcast? Well, a podcast is something where you can see a microphone in the video. That's not necessarily a podcast, really. And I'm just slightly concerned about some of the numbers which are coming out, which are really just showing the popularity of a platform which has been here for 15 years, which people use for other things. And certainly any of the numbers that I talk to for any large podcast company, they're seeing tiny, tiny numbers on YouTube so far.
Interesting. I feel like YouTube, we think about it, it's adding visual to a podcast, and that has truth. The extent of the impact of that, I think, is debatable. But, where I actually see the best value for podcasts is YouTube's ability to share clips and to share content and to promote content in ways that we just don't have an interface yet through the typical audio platforms that allow for it. So I feel it has marketing advantages and maybe a really important strategy for not necessarily reach of consistent audience, but reach to recruit new audience. And I think that may be where some of the magic lies, and we get a little hung up in the consumption piece, and it may be less about that than advertising.
I hear what James is saying regarding the numbers, and they're probably not as big as that. But I will say, focus group of one, I'm making a conscious choice nowadays. When there were a number of sports podcasts that I would used to listen to that I did, whether or not they had a video component or not, I didn't know. I was mostly listening in the car. But they have become much more interesting to me watching on YouTube because of
Yeah.
the sports star that they're interviewing. I want to see that. The other day I was listening to Lex Friedman interviewing Jeff Bezos, and that's something I would like to see. A lot of Joe Rogan's content, like to see the person that he's interviewing, and so I'm gravitating more and more that way, and I think that could be very exciting for advertisers. You think we built out these 60 plus points of what an audio ad needs to do or needs to say. One of them is, can you do substantiation in this ad? Well, video, obviously, depending on the product, makes that so much easier, especially a physical product, but even a software or a service, you can certainly show things that you couldn't necessarily talk to. This is what happened with my revenue, when I implemented service X, Y, and Z. This is the dashboard that I use for my software as a service. That I think is going to force, because more and more pockets are going to have this video component. This is going to force advertisers to think about, okay, not just the bullet points that I'm sending the host, but what is the best presentation of the product that I need to mail them as well, so that they can show this on camera.
Yeah, it's a nice ability to opt in on that, and maybe YouTube is just showing some momentum because they're a little quicker to make video easy to include. But I was listening to Spotify, and now there's a video for everything, at least a part of a video, right? And it's like, how, and they're also creating videos for some of these songs, which are different than what you see on Spotify. But at what point, whatever platform you're listening to a song on, will you either be able to see part of or all of the full video? And is it not just going to be the same thing for podcasts at some point?
Well, and I think this is the difference between YouTube and YouTube Music. YouTube Music is YouTube's audio product. It does music. You can turn the video on for every single song, if there is a video, of course. So that's nice. And you can listen to a ton of podcasts on there. Weirdly, YouTube Music plays RSS feeds itself. So you can actually get a proper podcast onto YouTube Music. And YouTube Music, if you're on an Android phone, is one of those must-install apps that Google insists that you install on that. So I would suspect that we will see quite a lot of usage of YouTube Music to consume podcasts in some way, shape, or form. The user experience is most certainly not there yet, but I think that we will probably see that coming. I think there is a big difference between YouTube and YouTube Music, and I think it's very easy for people to go, YouTube, that's video, isn't it? And that's a big, video tool and blah, blah, blah. But actually, I suspect that we'll see YouTube Music being used more and more for podcast consumption. And, all of the research that we've seen research from Spotify, we've seen research from Sounds Profitable as well around video podcasting. What all of that research appears to say is that people will consume audio while they are multitasking, while they're going around their day. In the evening, people will consume video, and they may well consume video of the same shows. So, Scott, to your point about some of the sports podcasts that you're watching, you will consume the audio of that while you're driving, but perhaps in the evening you'll put it on the screen because you can. And I think that that's an interesting change from where we've been.
Well, I hope that if people are watching this podcast on YouTube, they're able to see Kyle because he's been frozen in some wonderful poses. At first, he was just very curious or surprised. He was very surprised, and then he became curious and stayed there for a while. And now I see him moving, but it's quite different when you add a visual effect. Scott, we're almost out of time. I think I'm going to give you the last word here on the final story because I think it really relates to things that matter to buyers, to the chief audio officer. Can you take us through before we wrap here?
Yes, and I apologize for my home phone ringing in the background. Hopefully it's not too disruptive.
We can't hear that.
Excellent. Thank you, Zoom. Wow. Talk about your good technology. So the next story is really based on a study that Magna and SiriusXM Media performed. and it's kind of the as we used to say in the 80s, the no duh story of the day, because it's really saying that the more data that you have to work with, the better that your advertising campaign can be, the more efficacious it'll be, the more effective it'll be. And it finds that, based on a buy, simply looking at demographic data, so age, income, gender, and comparing the effectiveness of a buy where you're using that as your targeting versus a lot more targeting through first party and third party data, which could include all sorts of things: geography, people in your family, your behaviors, your buying habits, things like that. It's really no surprise that in general, the aided awareness and responsiveness of somebody listening to an ad that's really specifically targeted to them and their behaviors is going to outperform kind of a general ad targeting a male 45 years old with an income of $100,000. Now, when I first saw this, my first reaction was, yeah, but how much does that cost? Because I've very often shown, especially on the digital side, that sometimes the more generic targeting, say even like targeting males versus males 35 that live in Los Angeles with this kind of car, can often be a much more effective from a cost per acquisition standpoint method of advertising than that very deep targeting. But the study kind of concludes here that actually the cost for a listener, the cost per new customer, is actually lower with that much more detailed advertising, much more detailed targeting. My advice to marketers would be like, sure, like this makes sense, but don't just trust this data. I think testing both the bigger demographic targeting and the very minute demographic targeting really needs to happen, so you know where to optimize your dollars in the future.
James, or what's left of Kyle, any final thoughts here?
I think from my point of view, I find all of this data really interesting. I'm always sort of slightly dubious around data which shows, which tries to claim, big differences between somebody with a 64% receptivity to a 70% receptivity. To me, that's probably within the realms of a margin of error. But I do think that all of this is really, really helpful data. And certainly if you're a chief audio officer listening to this kind of data is actually data that can help you get more budget, get more revenue into the audio world. And I think from that point of view, it's really useful.
Well, James, thank you for joining us from tomorrow on the other side of the world. And thank you, Scott, for saddling up with us again here. And thank you, Kyle, for the time that you spent with us during half of this podcast. We really appreciated having you. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is still brought to you by Oxford Road, where we don't just want you to be successful in audio. We want you to use your influence for good and to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, and to build bridges across differences. If you're a marketer and you're looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com. And do not forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, which is edited by Kyle, where he is 100% present every week. It's called The Influencer. If you want to hear from us, send us an email at info@mediaroundtable.com. And we have an extra podcast that is produced by Stu Redwine, our fantastic head of creative. This is the only show of its kind that focuses specifically on the best thinking in audio creative. And he's talking to people from across the ecosystem. Dallas Taylor at 20,000 Hertz, Amanda DeMarco from Veritonic. We've got a lot of industry leading thinkers and voices who are talking about how to have the best creative in the market. And season 1's about to wrap up, so make sure you download ad infinitum. Thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Scott, Mary Jane, Everett, the team at Podcast One, and as always, influence responsibly.